a clarification question or something to that effect, either to send it in the chat or to pop and interrupt me quickly. But otherwise, if you have a broader question or contribution, I'll make sure to have dedicated times for participation where I'll stop and I'll field those questions and comments, and then we'll keep going on together. But tonight, what we're going to discuss is our Parshat Balak. And Parshat Balak is another very strange Parsha. I mentioned before how Sefer Bamidbar a little bit goes off the rails. It starts including all these sort of strange things. We have Para Aduma, which we don't expect. And now in this week's Parsha, we have a long account, perhaps the only account, definitely the only account in the Torah, if not all of Tanakh, where the Jewish people aren't the subject. They're not the main actors. The main focus of Parshat Balak is Bilam and the Moabi king, Balak, the king of Moab. And it's very unusual to have a story where, especially in the Torah of all places, where the Jewish people are the background characters, and it's the other people, the people we're at war with, we're fighting, they get the main stage, they get the main focus. And we'll discuss a little bit in the sermon this week, more about the Bilam Balak story in particular. But what I want to discuss today is a little bit the Bilam Balak story, but more about how that leads into, and ultimately the role of the conclusion of this week's Parsha. The incident with the Midianite women, with Zimri and Cosby, and ultimately with Pinchas avenging the Jewish faith. But just before I begin, I just want to make a quick note that something that we always used to do back in Mosheva, when I used to be a BMP, a Beit Midrash person at Mosheva. I met Shoshana in the Beit Midrash at Mosheva. I have a lot of fond memories of Mosheva. But one of the things we'd always talk about every year in Parshat Balak is we know that when Pinchas stood up, or really Balak or Pinchas, when Pinchas stood up and killed Cosby and Zimri, then because they were violating the law, that was a good thing, and God rewards him. In other words, in some regard, in some examples, minimally in the setting of Pinchas, being a kanai, being a zealot who stands up for God is a good thing. But on the other hand, we know, just to take a more recent historical example, when Yigal Amir assassinated Yitzchak Rabin, and he said he was doing it on the basis of Jewish law, he said he asked the rabbi, he got a psak, and it was because Yitzchak Rabin was violating Jewish law by giving back the land of Israel. We all pretty much agree that it was a tragedy that he assassinated a leader in cold blood. And really, that's just to say that while we praise Pinchas, and we're about to discuss a story of zealotry, the actual modern application of zealotry is very complicated. It's not very obvious how that works. And in fact, more than complicated, it's really very dangerous. So I just want to make it clear that everything we discuss is in the specific context of the story in the Torah. And it's not a discussion of zealotry in any way that could be applicable. I remember one of my teachers, Rabbi Aryeh Clapper, said that he always thinks this is one of the most dangerous parshiot in the Torah, because it's really dangerous to talk about ideas of zealotry, of violence, of non-sanction. Moshe doesn't sanction, the Beit Din doesn't sanction this violence, but really Pinchas gets up on his own and takes action into his own hands. So obviously, while we value personal initiative, while we value standing up for God and Torah, I just think it's always important before discussing these ideas and launching into this parshiot to have the disclaimer that while this is all important values and things we'll discuss on a theoretical plane, it's certainly much more complicated how that translates into the contemporary practical world. So that's all just a disclaimer before we jump into the discussion of ultimately Pinchas, Zimri, Cosby, and the entire episode surrounding the Midianite women.
So, I for one promise I will not take anything you say tonight and do anything radical with it.
Good to know, Richard. Thank you. I'm glad you're not going to be spearing anybody after tonight's talk. Well, if you guys do want to take radical action, we can discuss what I think needs radical. No,
except on the canvas.
Oh, very good. All right. So all of that was our necessary background to make sure that Richard doesn't spear anybody. But I remember a few years back, one of my friends had a great pun about how in this week's Parsha, we have Cosby being speared for his inappropriate sexual behavior, and that was just around the time that Cosby was being sued for his various inappropriate actions. So there's a pun there, the Cosby. Anyways, so we get into now Parshat Balak, and the heart of Parshat Balak, like we said, is really the Bilam story. And while the sermon will more address the Bilam story, I just wanted to highlight that the Bilam story, as we know, the premise is that Balak, this Moabi king, hires this prophet Bilam to go and curse the Jewish people. And instead of being able to curse the Jewish people, Bilam gives a blessing to the Jewish people. And I've just excerpted here 3 different verses, 3 different lines of the various blessings Bilam gives the Jewish people, just to see quickly inside. So for example, in source 1, we see Bilam says, Mi mana afar Yaakov, who can count the dust of Jacob, umispar et rova Yisrael, the number of the dust clouds of Israel, tamot nafshi mot yesharim, may I die the death of the yesharim, of the upright, otiyacharit kamohu, may my fate be like theirs. It's some sort of proclamation about how the Jewish people are so fertile and so successful that they're numerous in numbers that can't be counted like the dust of the earth. So just one point that we won't go into tonight is that this should remind us of the blessing God gives Abraham. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. That's an interesting idea that will relate to the sermon for those who read or listen to it this week. But more to the point of our shiur, we see that one theme we draw out of this is that the Jewish people are fulfilling the promise given to Abraham. They're becoming a numerous reproductive people. They're having success reproducing. And that is going to be part of their fulfillment of Abraham's promise of populating the land of Israel. Continuing on, we have a further blessing, or perhaps a more famous blessing, where Bilam says, "Ma tovu halecha Yaakov b'shchenotecha Yisrael." How fair are your tents, Jacob, how your dwellings, O Israel. He compliments the dwelling place and the living place of the Jewish people. And in context, it seems pretty obvious, and the rabbis for sure interpret it this way, that this is a comment on modesty, on appropriate behavior, on appropriate family life, that it's not just the physical tents being large or materially expensive. They're traveling in the desert. They probably don't have large tents. But the idea is that the homes that the tents represent are praiseworthy. You have homes that represent great values, family values, that appreciate what it means to raise a Jewish family, to be a part of a Jewish family. And perhaps even more pointedly, you have homes that value some sense of tzniut, some sense of modesty, of a sexual ethic, of some amount of ethic in the way you act, the way you talk, the way you conduct your interpersonal relationships, and that gets credit, that gets praise. So we have praise of the male, female, heterosexually oriented reproductive relationship of the numerous Jews. Similarly, we have praise that the Jewish people have some amount of sexual ethic or maintain some amount of sexual relationships in line with God's commandment. And then finally, we see the result of this, a byproduct of living this modest, godly life, is that the Jewish people experience not just success in multiplying, success in the home, but also success in the battlefield. They crouch like a lion, like the king of beasts who dare rouse them. Blessed are those who bless you, cursed are those who curse you. So this again is now a lead-in to your enemies will fall by you, you'll have military success, etc. And again, this ties in well to the sermon that we'll begin this week again. We have another parallel, another echo of Abraham. Abraham is told that those who bless you will be blessed, that those who curse you will be cursed. Bilam's blessing is that those who bless you shall be blessed, and those who curse you shall be cursed. So really what we see is that the blessings that Bilam gives over to the Jewish people, or if we take it in the drashic rabbinic context, the intended curses that God switches to blessings, basically praise the Jewish people for 2, maybe 3 primary ideas, and that is part of a larger context or promise. They praise the Jewish people for their ability to reproduce and create families, for the ability to raise families that are moral, and then finally that will lead to successful military victory where your enemies will be accursed and your allies will be blessed. And all of this is coming in the context, of course, of the Jewish people being about to wage the first war with Moab, to enter the land of Israel, to conquer Israel. In other words, we have a repetition, we have an echo here of the Abrahamic promises, because the Jewish people are about to fulfill the promise of Abraham. They're about to enter the land of Israel as a numerous nation and conquer and settle the land God promised Abraham. That's the context we're dealing with, and that's really what's being reflected in Bilam's blessings. Bilam is essentially saying over and over again, you are the people that God promised Abraham would be worthy of inheriting this land one day. That's who you are. And that blessing makes a lot of sense in context. It makes a lot of sense to the close reader who remembers these blessings from Parshat. Great. So that makes a lot of sense what we have in the preface, in the build-up to the end of our Parsha. The only problem is that when we actually look at the end of our Parsha, instead of seeing a numerous sexually ethical Jewish people preparing to enter Israel and successfully conquer the land, we find the exact opposite. We find a Jewish people who are being completely subverted, who are being completely led astray by their military opponent, who is tempting them with sexual lasciviousness, using their daughters, using the young women of their society to lead Jewish people and Jewish leaders astray, and ultimately using this weakness, this sexual lustful weakness, to attack the Jewish people in a successful military psyops operation to prevent them both from organizing amongst themselves practically, but also from winning God's merit, deserving divine intervention in their conquest to enter the land of Israel. So while Bilam might be praising us, these wonderful, lofty praises, these wonderful blessings that reflect Abrahamic blessings, the Abrahamic covenant of conquering Israel, the facts on the ground actually look very different. So we'll look inside now and we'll see Bamidbar Chafhei, the end of our Parsha, where we get a glimpse to what's going on in the Jewish camp while the whole Bilam scene is taking place. So that brings us to source 4, and we'll read it inside together now. Vayeshev Yisrael b'Shittim, the Jewish people were staying in Shittim. Vayachal ha'am liznota b'not Moab, and the people profaned, interesting word, vayichal, to be profane, chal or chulen. They profaned liznot, to engage in some amount of inappropriate sexual relationship, el b'not Moab, with or towards the women of Moab, the daughters of Moab. And they called the nation to offer to their gods. And the people came and bowed and prayed to their gods. So first of all, just fascinating. It's interesting to see that part of being enticed to the women of Moab involves some amount of sacrifice to paganry. And there's, of course, 2 levels to this. One level is just saying that if they're sleeping with the women of Moab, they're really joining their families or joining their cultures, and they're having an influence. We know that throughout halacha, there's a concern of chasnus or chatnut, that if you intermix with other faiths, that could have a big impact on your religious practice. So maybe that's what we're seeing reflected here. But perhaps more historically, or geared with a closer eye to the ancient Near East, we know that, for example, one of the most common forms of idolatry at the time, Asherah, or really we know they're worshiping Baal, who is the husband of Asherah. Asherah and Baal was a form of paganry that involved sleeping with virgins in front of the Asherah tree to ensure a fertile harvest. That you would sacrifice the virginity of a Asherah priestess, and that sacrifice of virginity would ensure that your land is just as fertile as this young woman. So I think we see that really, that's just an Asherah, which we know is connected to Baal, the religion of these Moabi women. But even beyond that specific example, we know overall, there's this interesting historical connection that sexual lasciviousness is tied to one religious practice, and more than just genuine religious practice focused on fertility of both women and of the fruits of the land. So we have this sort of obfuscation or subversion of the Abrahamic covenant, of having fertile descendants, of having a fertile land of Israel. Instead, we see the Jewish people are engaging perhaps in pagan practices of fertility, sleeping with these daughters of Moab as part of the worship of Baal and Asherah. Given that, it's not surprising that the next pasuk we see, Yitzamed Yisrael leBaal Peor, and the Jewish people attach themselves to Baal, the Baal of Peor, okay, but same person, same entity, or same pagan entity, Baal. Vayichar af Hashem b'Yisrael, and God got angry at the Jewish people. So we see perhaps 2 sins, or at least 2 steps of a sin. Step 1 involves the lustful or physical attraction to the daughters of Moab. Step 2 involves the pagan practice of worshiping Baal. The ultimate conclusion is God's anger, but we're left a little bit unclear, a little ambiguous. Is God angry that they're sleeping with the daughters of Moab? Is God angry that that leads them to worship other gods? Or is God angry at the whole thing? We don't know. We just know that after they sleep with the daughters of Moab, that leads to avodah zarah, and then God gets angry. Okay, so far we have a pretty typical Jewish people story, unfortunately. They worship avodah zarah and God gets angry. But this time it's couched in this military, almost like psyops, covert ops operation of sending out the daughters to corrupt the Jewish people. Sorry, I'm still a little bit under the weather. And Hashem says to Moshe, Kach et kol roshei ha'am, take all the leaders of this nation, v'hoka otam laHashem neged hashamesh, and have them publicly impaled before Hashem, across or parallel to the sun, or in broad daylight, v'yishov charonath Hashem Yisrael, so that the Lord's wrath may finally die down from Israel. So God tells Moshe, impale the sinners, impale those people who are sleeping with the Midianite women. Sorry, I keep saying Moab, really Midian, with the Midianite women. But Yomer Moshe al Shofte Israel, and Moshe says to the judges of Israel, Hergu ish anashav v'nisamdim leval pa'or. So Moshe says, go and kill the people who are worshiping Baal Pa'or. Fascinatingly, God commands Moshe to do this, and Moshe is told, Kachet kol roshei ha'am, take all of the heads of the nation. And instead of Moshe going rounding up the heads of the nation and impaling them, Moshe turns to the judges, arguably other leaders in the Jewish people, and tells them to deal with it. So that's a little bit interesting. I think it's a little unclear how precisely Moshe is fulfilling the command of God, but we can leave that a little open for now. And a man from the Jewish people came, by Karev Elachav, and he came close to his brethren, at a Midianit le'enei Moshe, and he brought close to his brethren the Midianite, this Midianite person, and in the eyes of all of Israel, and Moshe and the Israelites, everybody was crying at the mouth of the Oel Moed, of the tent of meeting. V'yar Pinchas ben Elazar, and the Pinchas ben Elazar, we know Aaron's son, ben Aaron HaKohen. Then Pinchas came out of the tent of meeting with a spear in his hand. And he came after this Jewish person, El HaKuba, to the Kuba. The Kuba is, I guess, a chamber we see here, into the chamber, whatever chamber that is. And he impales this man and the Midianite woman he's sleeping with. And after he impales this Midianite man, this Midianite woman and this Jewish man, then the plague that God sent stops. So we see two important things. One, Moshe is commanded to kill the leaders who are sleeping with Midianite women. Moshe passes that on to the Shoftim, the judges, and nobody does anything. Everybody just sits around crying, completely inactive. And finally, it's only when Pinchas stands up and zealously takes action that anything gets done. So first of all, we see this break in the chain of command in the telephone game from God to Moses to the leaders, that somewhere along the way away, that breaks and the command of God doesn't get fulfilled. Pinchas has to stand up and do something on his own. Additionally, we see, and this is just a fun, classic biblical methodology, we see that the Midianite man and the Midianite woman and the Jewish man are merely referred to again and again anonymously as the man and the woman. It's only later on that we'll learn that their names are Zimri and Cosby. And that's always interesting to think, why and when does the Torah introduce names to characters? When does it focus on the personality of the character, the name of the character, who they actually are? And when does it depict a character as merely instrumental to a plot it's putting forward? Or perhaps for some other reason, it doesn't want to give them the respect of unnaming them. It wants to show that these once leaders, such as Zimri, were so disgraced that they no longer deserve mention. But it's always interesting to note, we have anonymous sinners being impaled by Pinchas. Ultimately, it is Pinchas who listens to God's command of impaling the sinful leaders. That causes the plague to stop. And those who died in this plague were 24,000. Great, or not great, really tragic. But we have here an episode of sin followed by plague, followed by divine punishment, only stopped when Pinchas gets up and does what God originally commanded. In return, Pinchas is rewarded. By Moshe Yemor, Hashem speaks to Moshe, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen heshiv chamatim al bnei Israel. Pinchas calms my anger, b'kanot kinati b'tocham, when he stood up for my jealousy, my rage, my zealotry. V'lo cheliti et bnei Israel b'kinati. I will not wipe out the Jewish people in my kina, in my jealousy, my anger. Therefore say, I shall give him a covenant of peace, which, as we know and we'll see together inside, the later rabbis and commentators explain means the priesthood, the kahuna. Only Aaron and his sons, direct sons at the time, were given the kahuna, were given the priesthood. Pinchas is the first of the later generation of the grandsons of Aaron to be inducted into the priesthood. It wasn't clear at that point, would the priesthood be continually, succeeded through inheritance, through patrilineal inheritance. Just because Aaron and his sons are appointed Kohanim, that doesn't necessarily mean all future generations will be Kohanim. Pinchas presumably earned that right. He deserved it by doing this good thing. He became inducted into a Kohen, even though he was a grandson. And for future generations, he and his family will retain the kahuna. It'll be to him and his descendants, Brit Kunat Olam, an eternal covenant of kahuna, because rather than just being Aaron and his sons, Pinchas is assured that the priesthood will remain in the family forever. And because he fulfilled the jealousy or the envy of God, and he atoned for the Jewish people. So that's the story we have here. Essentially, we have a story that the Jewish people sin. God tells Moshe to do something about it. Moshe tells the judges to do something about it. No one does something about it. So then Pinchas goes and does something about it, and God rewards him. So just off the bat, this story is incredibly strange. So one important question, of course, is what is this connection between this story and the Bilam story? There's a whole bunch of connections. I just want, for the purpose of our shiur, for us to assume the most simple connection, and that is, as illustrated later on in the Torah, it seems to imply, and it seems the pshat is, Bilam was the one who recommended this strategy of enticing the Jewish people with the daughters of Moab, with the Bnot Moab. In other words, we hear about Bilam, and we get this whole story about Bilam as an introduction to the role he ultimately plays in the Jewish conquest. He gives the other side, he gives the Midianites a suggestion, a military strategy that is extremely effective. Entice the Jewish people into sinning with your daughters, and then God won't be on their side anymore. So that's the simple pshat as to why this is prefaced by the Bilam story. This is really chronologically the next step in the Jewish conquest of Israel, and it's the strategy that the Jewish opponents are using against them. Great. But what about the content of this story? It's extremely strange. The Jewish people are sinning with Midianite daughters. Where does that come from? Moshe doesn't do what God tells him to, seemingly. Pinchas does do what God tells him to. What is this story contributing? What is going on in the story? It should immediately set off alarm bells. It's just a very strange story, very little context, very little to work with or to understand. So we're almost halfway through shiur now, or I guess a third of the way through shiur. So that's why I just want to open the floor for any questions or comments just on the story itself we're going to focus on, and then I'll present the main conceit of our shiur together. So does anyone have anything they want to say at this point? Any questions, any comments, etc.? If not, it's okay, but opening the floor for a couple minutes.
Not surprisingly. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I see you raised your hand, Richard.
Joel, go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to phrase this delicately, but nowadays, I mean, I've heard it from. I find it disgusting. I'm making a value judgment, but I've heard it from some very extremely orthodox people, and there's a whole halachic discussion, the idea, it's okay. The idea of having sex with a non-Jewish woman is okay as a married man because of various halachic reasons. And it's no big deal as long as it's done privately.
Pretty strange. I can tell you that is not true.
I know, but I'm telling you, I've heard it from Hasidim. Meini da denachriya rak midavrabanan, and it's rationalizations. I know, but I've heard it from quite a few people. But my point being that as long as it's done quietly, I know it's a rationalization. But here it seems it's a combination of sex with a non-Jewish woman, but also the idea of paganism.
Excellent. Yeah. I think that's exactly clear in the Psukim, that it's not just the sexual ethic, which is problematic, but the sexual ethic is so problematic, it can lead to paganism. That's how we know definitively it's problematic. I think it's a very good point, though, you're raising, that one of the things we didn't mention or focus on too much, but is definitely true in the story, is that it's not just that Zimri sleeps with Cosby, but that he has the gall to do it in public in front of the Ohel Moed. That certainly contributes to what makes him deserving of such a zealous and harsh punishment. It's not just the sin, but it's the statement, the political statement, the religious statement he was attempting to make through the sin. I think that's a great
also, if it were a sacrificial act or a religious act, one would want to do that in public, probably, because this is a demonstration of the avoda, as it were.
Excellent. I think that's a really good point as well. That perhaps it's not just gall, but it's an example of how much they bought into the Asherah pagan culture, that they're going to the holy site, to the temple, to have public sex with a young woman, which we know is part of how they worshipped Asherah and Baal back in the day. That it's trying to inform us not just that they had lascivious, lustful sex, but that they did it as part of a known ritual of another religion. I think
sure there's no connection, but I always love these linguistic possibilities. That Kuba in some sources means the dome or a dome. It's also the mosque where Muhammad said his first prayers before going off to wherever he went, Medina maybe or Mecca, but somewhere. So it was a holy spot, or a dome, a cubicle, something of that.
Yeah, the Kuba, of course, has a very long life in Islam following.
Yeah.
And it looks like a tefillin box. No, seriously.
Yeah, it's a big black box with a little gold.
Well, that's the Kaaba. It's a different word.
We're not talking about the
Kaaba. Kuba is sounded more like what I was looking for. Then Kaaba may be different. I mean, again, I'm just making up this word connection, but maybe it's there.
Yeah, Richard McBee, you were going to say something before?
I was who?
And then Sandra, I see you raising your hand.
Oh, okay. Please let her go, and then I wanted.
Oh, wait, sorry. Oh, I said Richard McBee. Richard Bell, were you still saying something?
Yeah, but if Sandra wants to go. All right, but so what I was saying was that what I wanted to say was there is the concept, of course, that when you're at the Hasidic perspective, that when you're at the greatest point of holiness, that's when the likelihood of falling into sin is the greatest. And these people we know wandering around, I mean, they did, after all, see a lot of interesting things, and they were part of the beginning. They were at the heights, but they certainly fell to the lowest. And we know that the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah didn't leave until 600 years later or more.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely true as a Hasidic concept. I always thought the Hasidic concept was a little bit Christian-y though, because the famous Hasidic story is that a famous Hasidic, the Rabbi dies and is dying or something, and says he's so jealous of a sinner because for him, every little mitzvah he did, every big mitzvah he did was so easy, it wasn't a big deal. But for the sinner, every small thing he did was a huge success. So he gets more schar. But to me, that always just sort of felt like Jesus saying that it's harder for a rich man to get into, it's harder to for a rich man to get into heaven than to pass a camel through a needle. I always thought it was
but I'm sure you know very well that so much of what has become Christianized found its sources in Jewish origins.
For sure.
And I read a line, I'm not going to go into this at length, but I've been revisiting an old friend of mine, or an old sort of a roommate of mine, Art Green, and revisiting some of his writing. And he made such a startling statement, but I think it was right. He said, had I been there at the beginning of Christianity, I might easily have become one of them because they were saying Jewish things.
Yeah.
And they were saying Jewish things that later Hasidim, and he, of course, is something of a neo-Hasid, they were saying what we're saying, or maybe always did. That's his point. Maybe we always did. But I'll let that go.
Topic for another time, but I am a big fan of Art Green, so I'm glad that you brought it up. All right, Richard McBee, what were you about to say? And then
so I have the 3 questions or comments.
All right, 3.
One is there's a switch here. We start out with the Moabite women, and then they suddenly become Midianite women.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
So that's a very big switch that is seemingly unexplained. We also have a curious fact that a plague stops. Nowhere does the text tell us the plague began. So the plague is suddenly, what plague stopped? What's going on? But really, the elephant in the room that screams out, and it's one that I probably would address. I've done a painting of this Pinchas episode, and it's one that I'm really love. I'll send it to you. But the real big elephant in the room is, how can it be that when the greatest prophet of the non-Jews is directed by God, manipulated by God to bless the Jews, and these blessings don't take effect? How could that be? We assume blessings aren't just wishful thinking. And in fact, we assume, no, Bilam saw the reality of the Jewish people worthy of these blessings. And yet the story says, nope. So that's the elephant in the room to me.
Excellent question. I think Sandra has something to say on that matter.
Okay.
Yeah, Sandra.
Hi, just to respond a moment to Richard's question. The way I have dealt with this, and I've read about it a little bit as well, maybe Rabbi Stoller can tell us some midrashim on the subject also that might jive with this, is that the prediction doesn't say when it's going to take hold.
Huh.
So all of their sexual modesty, their tents and their modesty, their homes and their modesty, it may be that those things were happening at the present time that validated and gave reason for the future blessings to be showered upon Israel. But I didn't understand that it meant that right then, those blessings of military victory, sexual modesty, and the rewards therefrom would happen right then. So that's how I answered your question, which is you're assuming in your elephant in the room question, Richard, that should take place right away. And I don't know that that's so. That's number one. And then my question was a little bit of just a question / comment, which is, is anybody curious about the fact, also really to an extent, it riffs off Richard's prior comment, but I didn't know that at the time when I was thinking this. What about the fact that Moses is married to a Midianite?
Ah, beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So Sandra's comment.
Yeah, I just have to, because I did forget one thing. Not only is Moses married to a Midianite, but also when you say Moab, what do you think?
Obviously,
Ruth.
sexual.
We think of Ruth.
promiscuity.
I mean, it's like it screams out at you, right? I mean, so it's like just on two cases. Now, of course, Ruth is later, but still, wow, the echoes in there. You're right, Moses and the Midianite and his Midianite wife, and Ruth, part of the line of David.
Excellent. A lot of really great points here. I'm not going to be able, unfortunately, to address all of the technical questions. Those are really great points, though. Obviously, it goes without saying that whenever the text says Moab and then switches to Midian, whenever the text says two different things, the ways of resolution are either to say it was both or it was one or the other. So all the midrashim and commentaries either try to explain how it was both the Moavi and Midianite women, or how really it was the Moavi women who really were Midianite women, and it's like this whole complicated game. I'm honestly not sure of pshat, like what a simple understanding is to say there, and I really welcome anyone, if you can find one, to inform me. Sandra's making an amazing point, both in terms of the bracha and in terms of Moshe's own connection. I think this is going to be so key. In terms of the bracha, it's just a general rule we have across Tanakh. So whenever a prophet says something that isn't fulfilled, we have faith it'll be fulfilled in the future. It's not talking about now. That happens all the time, of course, in later Nevi'im who prophesize redemption that doesn't come in their lifetime. So not so surprising, the same thing can happen with Bilam. He prophesies a great Jewish people. They weren't so great yet, but they will one day. But Sandra's raising a great point, and we'll see it inside of the Midrash, that this entire discussion of Midianite women should be taken with the background understanding that Moshe himself is married to a Midianite woman, a woman that's raised by the Midrash, and we'll get there soon. So all excellent points. I think all of this is really raising two main takeaways, I'd say. One, this story, especially in its context, is very surprising. And two, part of what makes it so surprising is the role Moshe is playing. Moshe seems to be personally indicted, or at least has some connection to the sin involved, as one who marries a Midianite woman. But nonetheless, Moshe is, or perhaps because of that, Moshe is not the one who ultimately stops the not-mentioned plague. So Moshe seems to have a very personal connection to what's going on, but then have a surprisingly small role in bringing about the plague, ending the plague, addressing the sins at hand. I think that's really what we're all sort of touching on with some of our questions. I think that's an excellent point. All this is really, really great. I want to add one more factor to complicate how we view this story. And that is that we should view this story, in my opinion, and I get this largely from Dr. Yoni Grossman, as I get a lot of my views of Sefer Bamidbar. I was lucky enough to learn it with him. But I think we should view this story largely in the context of, as we discussed last week in Parshat Chukat, the second generation of Jewish people repeating the sins of the first generation of Jewish people. Now, I know what you're thinking. What sin did the first generation of Jewish people do with sleeping with another nation in the desert? And the truth is, there is no sin that the first generation did that parallels this that the second generation did. But there is one sin that is very parallel in textual references, and maybe even a little bit in the actual content of what's being discussed here. Because as I think it was Joel mentioned originally, it wasn't just the sin of sleeping with non-Jewish women here that was problematic, but it was about how it led to avodah zarah, how it led to adopting the non-Jewish lifestyle and ultimately pagan ritual practice, or perhaps that was part and parcel, maybe it was an Asherah worship where sleeping with the women were part of the sexual practice, whatever it might be, there's this connection here between sexual promiscuity and avodah zarah. And given that, I think it shouldn't surprise us so much that we have a similar parallel elsewhere in the Torah. So if you'll bear with me, you'll look in source Hey, we have Shemot 32, Exodus 32, the story of the Egel Hazah, the story of the golden calf. And in the story of the golden calf, we hear, the Jewish people awake in the morning, V'ya'alu olot, and they offer sacrifices, V'yigishu shlamim, they bring peace offerings, V'yeshav ha'am lechol v'shato, they eat and drink their sacrifices in front of the golden calf, V'yakumu litzachik, and they get up to frivolously dance, to play. And of course, as we know, consistently throughout the Torah, the rabbis, as brought by Rashi, interpret litzachik, to play, yesh b'mashma zeh giloy arayot. It regularly means some amount of sexual or inappropriate physicality, interaction, etc. So by the golden calf, we have another great example of the Jewish people committing a national sin of avodah zarah that may or may not be intrinsically tied to sexual promiscuity. And if that was the only parallel, it'd be pretty weak. Like there's a lot of times the Jewish people do these two sins. But thankfully, the parallel is actually extremely strong and persistent throughout the section we just read. So if we look at source 7, we just read that the Jewish people were in Shittim, right? And they offered these sacrifices, fine. So we see again by the Egel HaZahav, they similarly offer sacrifices. Then by the Egel HaZahav we see, God threatens that he's going to get angry, that he's angry at the Jewish people. And in our story, what do we see? Yisrael of Baal Pa'or, the Jewish people serve Baal Pa'or, Vayichar af Hashem Yisrael, a parallel of God's reaction to the avodah zarah. In both cases, we have word for word Vayichar af. God gets angry, or really his nose gets inflamed. God gets so angry. Continuing in this parallel, in the story of the Egel, we see the punishment for creating a golden calf and worshiping it is widespread plague. God sends a plague, and that kills the people who worship the calf. And while Richard pointed out we don't get any instance of God sending the plague, we see by virtue of its resolution, clearly God also sends a plague in our story. Those who died from the plague are be'im v'esrim elef, 24,000. So far, we have two stories where the Jewish people go off on their own, don't listen to Moshe. Moshe is not an actor. The result is avodah zarah, idolatry, and sexual promiscuity. In response, God gets angry, his nose flares up, and he sends a plague that kills thousands of Jewish people. Now, what's the resolution to this plague? Well, in Exodus, the resolution is that the Jewish people have to turn on each other. That someone from the Jewish nation, the Levites, someone from the tribe of Levi, stands up, takes a sword, and kills their fellow brethren for worshiping the golden calf. So Moshe says to them, the them here being the Levites, so says God, Simu ish charbo ayerecho, take your sword, Ibru v'shuva mashar l'shar ma'achaneh, go from house to house of the camp, and kill your brethren who worship the golden calf, whether they're your friend or your family. So the Jewish people from the tribe of Levi rise to the challenge, and they kill the sinners, even if they're related to them. Similarly, in our story, Moshe commands the tribal leaders to take their swords and kill those who worship Baal Pa'or. But ultimately, who is it that does it? Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron from the tribe of Levi. So again, in both stories, we have someone from the tribe of Levi, or all of the tribe of Levi, being empowered to take their sword, and with that empowerment, to go and kill the sinful Jews. The result of this killing, of this aggressive act or reparation, is that the pasuk tells us, Vayim lacharat in Exodus, the next day, Vayomer Moshe ala'am, Moses tells the nation, Ata chatatem chata gdola, you've committed a great sin, V'ata elel Hashem, and now I'll go up to God, Ulai achapra ba'at chatatem. Perhaps I will achieve atonement, perhaps I'll get kapara for you. And in the story of Pinchas, what do we hear Pinchas accomplishes through spearing Zimri through the stomach? What's the ultimate conclusion? Pinchas's personal reward, because he was jealous for God. Again, we have an invocation of kapara, of atonement. Just as a little bit of an aside, the word kapara comes from the same root as the word kaporet, the cover for the ark, the thing that stood on top of the ark, because kapara comes from the root of lechaper, to cover, because fundamentally atonement is covering or protecting yourself from punishment. Kapara actually focuses not necessarily on restorative justice, not on repairing one's relationship with God per se, but kapara in its strictest, most literal biblical sense, and this actually interestingly traces its roots all the way to the story of Eden, where Adam and Eve are kicked out of Eden, and they're given means to protect, lechaper, to cover themselves. But we see that in the strictest sense, kapara means protection from punishment. In the case of the golden calf, it was protection from the plague, from being destroyed completely. In the case of Pinchas, it was protection from the plague sent then that the plague stopped. Great. Now, what happened to the Levites because they didn't sin at the golden calf and they took upon themselves to enact God's will? Vayomer Moshe tells them, Milu yadchem hayom, dedicate yourselves, your hands have become full, you've been given a position. Which we know means, and Rashi tells us, Atem horagim otam, you Levites who have killed the sinners, that will make you priests and Levites to God. That is why you're given elevated status in the temple. Whereas, as we know, of course, what's the reward given to Pinchas? Pinchas is also given kahuna. He's given elevated status in the temple. He's given the priesthood. So just to review this grand picture we have here, we have another instance where the Jewish people disobey Moses, go off and commit a lascivious sin involving paganry, involving avodah zarah and idolatry. As a result, God gets angry. The anger leads to a plague that threatens to destroy the Jewish people. It's only when Jewish people themselves take swords and take it upon themselves to kill the sinners that God finally lets the plague stop. And in response, those Jews who took it upon themselves, those Jews from the tribe of Levi, or individual Jew, Pinchas, who took it upon themselves to stand up for God and end the sinful action, get rewarded with being elevated to the priesthood, being given a special place in the temple. So just before I go on and try and interpret any of this, is anybody not convinced by this parallel? Because I just convinced myself just repeating it out loud. It's a striking parallel. We have perhaps not intuitive, perhaps the first time you read the story you wouldn't think of it, but we see so many connections between this story and the story of the golden calf. I see that Richard McBee just unmuted to tell me he doesn't agree.
Well, I see the parallel, but first of all, it makes me deeply uncomfortable because of what it points to. I mean, on the surface, it points to a very pessimistic view of any kind of progress. We get the Torah, we mess up, we are, for other reasons, fated to die. An entire generation dies out, and a new generation comes into its place and basically does the exact same thing. How the heck are we going to be able to go into Eretz Yisrael? Now, of course, the fact is, it's a very rocky road in Eretz Yisrael also.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
it's just, I guess, it's depressing, excuse me.
I think that's a very, very fair point. I totally agree. One thing I'll point out as a good callback, for everyone in Shiur, if you weren't in Shiur when we did learn Sefer Shemot together, no problem. But one of the themes, one of the ideas we developed in Sefer Shemot was that ideally, the whole Jewish people were supposed to go up the mountain and receive the Torah. That was God's initial plan. The Jewish people were unwilling and refused, so they stayed back. And it was specifically that break between the divine plan and the Jewish enactment that created the space that allowed for the golden calf to take place. In other words, the sin of the golden calf was monumental, not just because it was a big sin, but because it represented a huge break between the plan, the original divine plan, what was going to happen, and what actually ended up occurring. And arguably, this break, this need to shift, to pivot, to call an audible, is truly encapsulated in the breaking of the luchot and the need to give another set of luchot. That the previous plan, the previous blueprint, the previous luchot were broken, and now there's a need for a new plan. So it's not just how sinful this action was that we're noting, but really its significance for the Jewish people's relationship to Moshe and the Jewish people's relationship to God, and therefore everything that takes place afterwards. And I think what we see here, again, is not necessarily just focusing the Jewish people are still sinful, but we have another episode where the Jewish people do sin, yes, but the sin is the type that is so pivotal, that is so instrumental, that it naturally leads to the next stage of the Jewish people. That it impacts everything forever after and colors what we see as the next step. Yeah, Richard Bell.
They're worse than still sinful because this is, I think, the next generation. And I saw Rabbi Soloveitchik answered an issue that we were talking about last week. What was Moshe's sin? And he says Moshe was not a declining leader, but he was the greatest leader, the greatest prophet that could, the greatest Rebbe that could ever have been. The people didn't deserve him. They didn't deserve a leader like him. Why? The first generation sinned. They had to die out. The second generation saw what happened to the first generation, and they did the same things. Moshe was beyond the world beyond them. And he could not, and maybe even was punished. We'll have to look into that another time. But at least he bore the responsibility in actuality, if not really the causative, but he bore the responsibility for a generation that was no better than the one that he instructed before.
Interesting. So Richard Bell, Lishitaso, brings an interpretation that like us, like me, like what we've been developing together, notices
I don't let go of a bone.
Jewish people, but as is Richard Shita, puts the blame solely on the shoulders of the Jewish people instead of Moshe. I think that's fair. That's definitely one interpretation. He invokes the Rav, which is like invoking God, God's self. So I'm here, far be it from me to inherit.
But I have to just say that I finished a piece I wrote a little while ago to somebody with the Jewish people whom I love. So I'm not fully guilty.
There you go, like Shner Zalman of Leead. Richard's just the Oev Yisrael. He can't help himself. But I think either way, whether you take Richard's read or my read, what we all can sort of see here, and what I want us all to see together in the Midrash, is that one way of viewing this story is that much like the Egel, it redefines the Jewish people and Moshe's relationship to each other. At the Egel, Moshe realized the Jewish people are not up to the challenge. They're not up to going up the mountain, and rather, they're a bunch of kids that he's going to have to babysit until the right time comes for them to enter Israel. And there starts to grow resentment, and it starts to grow distance, or perhaps you could say the Jewish people start to sin more, as Richard would say. The Jewish people start to deserve Moshe less, however you want to frame it. But we see the very beginnings of the failed or lack of ability to live up to expectations, the disappointments the Jewish people have within them, and that leads to this cycle of sin. We mentioned last week that we seem to be working backwards through that cycle of sin, going almost exactly in the opposite direction. And again, here, instead of opening up with this major event of Har Sinai and the Egel, it seems like we close with this major sin of the Jewish people failing to meet expectations, paralleling the Egel. But all of this is really wrapped together and tied together in this question of the relationship to Moshe and some of the little observations we made. So I just want to read a midrash together, a midrash that pulls together the connection to Har Sinai, the implicit criticism against Moshe, and ultimately the question of Moshe and Bnei Yisrael's relationship together. So the midrash in Sanhedrin, commenting on this episode, says as follows: Tivse beblurita. So Pinchas grabs Cosby by her forelock, whatever that is, via Eitzel Moshe, and grabs her by her hair and drags her to Moshe. Terrible, the image. Amar lo. So Pinchas says, Ben Amram. Oh, actually, this is this is not Pinchas, this is Zimri. Zimri grabs this Midianite woman, brings her to Moshe, and says, Ben Amram, a disrespectful way to refer to Moshe, son of Amram, not giving him his name and his title. Zu asura moteret. Is it prohibited or permitted for me to sleep with this Midianite woman? Vim tomar asura. And if you say it's prohibited, what about you? You also married a Midianite. You married Yitro's daughter, just like Sandra pointed out. So the Midrash says that what was the impetus for Zimri's sin? It wasn't how lustful he was after Cosby. It wasn't how lustful he was after Avodah Zarah. It was his resentment that Moshe seemed to be a hypocrite. You're going to tell me not to sleep with a Midianite woman while you sleep with a Midianite woman? And what happens in response? Nit'alma memeno halacha. The halacha is forgotten or disappears for Moshe. Personally, I think the classic interpretation that Moshe forgot the halacha is unthinkable. Moshe didn't forget the halacha. It disappeared, literally, because Moshe didn't feel like he had the standing to enforce the halacha. He felt like he'd be accused of hypocrisy. He wasn't the one who had the voice, the respect, and the position to enforce the halacha that, of course, he knew. So nit'al memenu halacha. Moshe had the halacha disappears from him. Ga'u kulam. Everybody starts fighting with chia, and it breaks out in this big tears. Everyone's crying. The hainu dichtiv, and that's what you said. The hema bochim petachol moed. Everyone was crying at the tent of meeting. B'ksiv, and then it says, V'yar Pinchas ben Elazar. Pinchas ben Elazar saw. Ma ra'ah, what did he see? Amar Rav. Rav says, Ra'ah Maisa. He saw Zimri sleeping with Cosby. V'nizkar halacha, and he remembered the halacha. What halacha did he remember? Amar lo. He said to him, Achi, Abba lo kach l'madatani b'radcha mahar Sinai haboal et kutitz k'nayin pogenbo. Didn't our father teach us? Didn't Moshe teach us at the foot of Har Sinai that one who sleeps with a non-Jewish woman, k'nayin pogenbo, they should be impaled by a zealot? In other words, we have a reference back to the foot of Har Sinai, to the very scene where the Torah was given, but also where the Egel HaZahav took place, where the sin of the Egel took place. The Midrash connects those two stories. What does Pinchas say? Pinchas says, Moshe might have forgotten or had the halacha disappear from him. I remember our time at the foot of Har Sinai. I remember what happened before and after the Egel HaZahav, the lead up to it, the consequences from it. And from that experience, what do I remember? K'nayin pogenbo. That a zealot, that somebody must stand up and defend the Jewish people. They must impale or defend God's will here. Much like at the foot of Har Sinai, the Egel HaZahav, those who worshipped Avodah Zarah were ultimately killed by the sword. So too, the proper psach, the proper halacha here is k'nayin pogenbo. Amar lo, karina de'igrasa ihu lihave parkana. So Moshe said to him, let the one who reads the letters be the agent. In other words, Moshe says, I'm not going to do it, but if you do it, go ahead. This itself is a whole interesting halakhic discussion. Why doesn't Moshe say you're right? Why does he just say, I'm not going to do it, but you can? It's a big halakhic discussion, whether Moshe agreed or not, whether Moshe was saying, even though I don't agree, you should go do it, etc. We're not going to go into that. But what we do see that I think is so essential is two big elements. Element one is that this midrash ties our episode to the foot of Har Sinai. It puts it in the context of the events that took place at the foot of Har Sinai, namely the giving of the Torah in an unplanned way. Instead of the Torah being given on the top of Har Sinai with all of the Jewish people present, it was given at the foot of Har Sinai with just Moshe representing God. And additionally, the sin of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, which parallels our story. But more than just paralleling us to the golden calf, it also highlights the contrast. It highlights what's so different about the golden calf and now. Because why did the people build the golden calf and worship it? Because they were so dependent on Moses' leadership that when Moses was gone for a few days, they panicked and worshipped idolatry. Whereas in this story, what's the conceit, what's the background, the impetus that leads to the sin? The attack on Moshe's authority. Moshe, you hypocrite, you sleep with a Midianite woman and tell us not to. Because what we have here is, again, a reliving of the second generation of the first generation sins, but with a slight difference that highlights to us the major shift in relationship that has taken place between the first generation and the second generation. Last week we saw how all of the sins that get repeated, whereas in the first generation, Moshe is the main actor and defender of the Jewish people, in the second generation, Moshe doesn't really play a role. The Jewish people sort of write him out or push him out. So too here, in the first generation, the Jewish people without Moshe experience such a crisis of faith that they do avodah zarah, they commit lascivious acts, they go as astray as one could. Here, Moshe is sitting at the Ohel Moed watching them, and that's not enough to stop them. They turn to Moshe and say, "You hypocrite." And what does Moshe do? He cries. He's inactive. He's incapable of doing anything about it. Ultimately, Moshe realizes, I can't be the one to act anymore. Pinchas, my grandnephew, the future generation of leaders, have to be the ones to act. So what we see in the story of Pinchas is an extremely painful recognition of Moshe, that we have another Egel HaZahav moment, we have another golden calf moment. But the answer isn't going to be, let's build a temple where all of us can worship together and you'll never feel like I left you again. The answer this time is you need a new leader. It's not for me to do anymore. I'm going to be passive, Moshe's going to be passive, and he's going to empower Pinchas. He's going to empower the new generation of leadership to take up zealotry, to take up their own causes, to take personal initiative, and to lead the way. So it makes perfect sense that we have a monumental shift. We have something as major as needing a second set of luchot. And that is needing a second leader after Moshe and Aaron. We need Pinchas and Yehoshua. And that's what the story is telling for us. It's giving us a repetition of the Egel, a repetition not necessarily of the details of the event, but of the setup and significance of the sin, but with a slight change being that Moshe is the one being accused of hypocrisy. Moshe is the one who is not taking action, and ultimately it's the new generation of leadership that must rise up to the challenge, and they're the ones who are promised the Brit Kunat Olam, the eternal treaty. Not Moshe, Aaron, and their children, but rather the new generation of leadership. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense of the story. Happy to hear any questions or comments. Yeah, Richard, for sure. And then other Richard.
So, which Richard?
Richard McNee raised his hand first, then Richard Bell raised his hand second.
So, okay, I mean, I very much appreciate your analysis, and I get it. I think, though, at the core of it is something that I find deep. Let's be nice about it. Deeply problematic, and that is ultimately, at least half of this is dependent upon blaming the women.
Oh,
and I just, I think we could get to a very similar place without doing that. In other words, it's just, in both these cases, you're emphasizing the sexual activity at Har Sinai, and then emphasizing this, and quote, Moshe just has no comeback. Well, of course, if it's actually true, this whole thing, then they're really, then Moshe is at fault for having married a Midianite, right? And nowhere do we see that in our tradition of him being at fault. So there's a problem in the core of this argument. Although I like the thrust of your argument of we need a new leader. These are different circumstances. I love all of that, but the way you get there, I find it very problematic.
I just want to respond quickly. I definitely would agree that there's a problematic blame laid at the feet of women. I would argue, unfortunately, that that's more biblical or rabbinic than specific to this interpretation. And I'd also point out that while it's unfortunate, it's actually another beautiful another unfortunate parallel to Egel HaZahav, that we know the rabbis blame the Egel HaZahav on women, because women gave their golden mirrors up to melt and make their nose rings and their mirrors and all their finery and jewelry. And then the rabbis say, oh, of course women would never part with their material stuff. That was a way to delay or to stall. But the women were so amped about avodah zarah, the women donated their stuff too. So I think it's unfortunately a parallel we see, that in both stories, women end up getting a disproportionate amount of the blame for the sin that takes place. But fair point. Yeah, Richard Bell.
So I want to say something entirely different, but in response to this, it may well have been the women's fault, just as it is to the women's praise, when we say that women, it's the woman in the house, the woman who is raising the child, who preserves the Jewish religion from one generation to the other. But religious people do their religion however it is. And if these women were enticed by, by their avodah zarah, then that was the influence they had. Women can be, behind every good, behind every bad. Maybe there is a woman. What I wanted to ask was, did you accept, and I was happy with Sandra's thought that the words of Bilam are just prophetic for the future, or did you have another resolution for that?
No, I think that's the best interpretation. I think that's like whenever we find throughout Tanakh that a prophet doesn't have their words fulfilled in their lifetime. It happens all the time with Yechezkel, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu. The best answer is that it must be something that's true for the future, even if it's not true right now.
Okay.
For sure. All right. Thank you, everybody. Oh, and
Sandra.
Sandra had your hand raised. Yeah, Sandra.
One point, if I may, I have to agree with Richard McBee that I think that it's over the top, uncalled for to put blame right at the feet of the women. And I'm just going to say, so we don't sound like proto-feminists and waving flags, sticking strictly to the Bible and to the text of the Chumash. Remember that no matter how the rabbis interpret it, the text of the Torah shows that the women walked in from generation one. The generation one women walked into the promised land, holding the hands of their granddaughters from generation two. So you can interpret it, not you, meaning others can interpret it any way they wish to fit whatever paradigm they want to fit it into, but just strictly interpreting the Parshat. Okay, the women from generation one were considered tzidkaniot, okay, and they walked. Imagine that, and it's the image is supposed to stay in our mind as quite dramatic. While all the men over the age of 21 died off, and none but Kalev and Yehoshua walked in. The older women holding their granddaughters' hands walked in, say the Midrashim, into the promised land and paid to all of this Chazarai. And that's it.
That may be in the Midrash, but I have to say I just
no. The text.
Okay, in the text of the Midrash, I disagree strongly though, because in my family, it was the women who misunderstood Judaism who drove because of Avodah Zarah, really. Yeah, but I'll go into that. Yeah, superstition. Who drove the family away to the degree that one of their children said to me, "I'm so happy my children don't keep a Seder. We're done with that."
Oh, there's always a question of anecdote versus historical evidence, but that's a fair life experience. But I'm definitely on side of not blaming women more than we have to, but also being open to the fact that men sin all the time in the Bible, so women might have too. But I definitely agree that there definitely are times where biblical interpretation pushes too heavily on blaming women, as we see all too common in perhaps Haredi communities nowadays. But I don't think this interpretation is dependent on blaming women as much as it's dependent on saying that Moshe was accused for his relationship with women, and that led to perhaps using women, which is awful, but using these Midianite women as a pawn in a demonstration, as a tool for military corruption, but not necessarily that they were given the agency to be making their own decisions. But either way, I think that's for sure a beautiful note to end on, that there is the biblical source that the women must survive even if the men didn't, because even during their lowest lows, some of the Jewish people at least still maintain their values. So I hope that is a bit of a positive note and an otherwise very pessimistic ending to our Parsha. But thank you, everybody. This was part 27 on why I think Moshe was replaced as a leader. So if you disagree, bring it up with Richard Bell, and we'll be same time, same place next week. Tomorrow night, instead of the usual tefillah shiur, we'll be having a 3-week /Shiva Tammuz related shiur, because this Sunday kicks off 3 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you, everyone. I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.